I'm often asked, how do you recognise the timber or the style that a piece of furniture comes from? Experience with the relevant pieces is my answer, but a broad overview would include relating the pieces to the ruling monarchs of the time, such as Queen Victoria and King Edward, and the timbers used in their construction. But always bear in mind that period styles overlapped, as did timber usage. It's not as if on June the 30th, 1890, an edict was issued declaring that all furniture built from now on would no longer be referred to as Victorian and subsequently Edwardian, and that any offenders would be prosecuted. But general timber usage and style can be related for the identification of most furniture. For example, this chaise lounge was built in about 1870 and is constructed of cedar. Its long flowing lines and ornamentation are indicative of the Victorian era. From 1840 to 1890, the common cabinet timbers used were blackwood, hew and pine, and cedar. Blackwood is a wattle, golden brown in colour, with darker streaks and black flecks where it gets its name. The grain is usually straight and the timber is very hard but excellent for turning. From settlement onwards, the hew and pine, taking 600 years to reach a useful size, has been one of the most favoured cabinet timbers found only in southwest Tasmania. A pale yellow when young, it matures to a rich honey colour and has a very fine straight grain. It is truly a beautiful timber, and due to its scarcity was later used only as an ornamental veneer. Red cedar. This is the epitome of Australian cabinet timbers. Used widely since Governor Phillip, it was highly prized as a furniture and decorative timber. Found and exploited from southern New South Wales to northern Queensland, its only presence today is in plantations, which are very susceptible to the cedar tip moth, or in New Guinea and parts of Southeast Asia. If you have anything made of red cedar, look after it. It was treasured as our own version of the marvellous South American mahogany, except that red cedar is generally worth far more than mahogany. This is South American mahogany, and this is Australian red cedar. They're almost identical, aren't they? So how do you tell the difference? Well, South American mahogany is much heavier in weight, and you can't push your fingernail into the grain. Whereas with the Australian red cedar, it's much lighter in weight, and it's quite easy to push your fingernail into the grain. Its rich red colour, soft texture and lightweight open grain make it a beautiful timber to work with. And when it's cut, it has a really distinctive odour. So ravaged were the cedar forests that by as early as 1802, the cedar trade was restricted by the governor and the military. In 1909, this Lasseter & Co. bedroom furniture catalogue had to give special quotations for anything wanted in red cedar. From 1890 to about 1910 was the Edwardian dynasty, incorporating Australian Federation. The Edwardian style was more angular than Victorian. The common timbers were maple, oak, and New Zealand kauri pine. Kauri pine has a lovely satin texture with a very straight and compressed grain. Whereas in comparison, this is your normal everyday radiata pine. And if you look closely, you can see that the grain is quite coarse and wiry and it has a very open structure. You can see why the New Zealand kauri pine was so valued. This tree, the radiata, would be harvested after 10 years, whereas the kauri, grown today in the right conditions, would have to live for more than 20 years before harvesting. The true kauri pine, commonly used at the end of last century as a furniture timber, was found only in New Zealand, where the trees reached up to 200 feet in height. But this, I think, would be a Queensland kauri pine. Its texture is softer, coarser and darker than the more highly valued New Zealand crop. However, after World War II, it too was virtually impossible to find, except in conservation plantations. The Queensland maple, a hardwood from North Queensland, became very popular with the decline of the cedar industry. The Queensland maple has a reddish tan colour, becoming rich honey when polished, and has a straight open grain, although sometimes wavy lines make it good for veneer work. Historically, oak was the main cabinet timber used right through to the 17th century in Europe. Even then, when walnut and mahogany were fashionable, oak was a popular timber and remained so until the 1930s. A very hard timber, when cut, it has a light creamy or pinkish brown colour with a ray-like fleck. Over time it will inevitably darken, and a true sign of its antiquity is this dark appearance, which is often imitated by various artificial stains. In Australia, the silky oak, or grevillea, was seen as the most likely substitute for the European version. A good deal lighter in weight than the European oak, it still has that similar ray-like fleck and a very unique sheen to it. The post-Edwardian period, from 1910 to World War II, included a number of styles such as arts and crafts, Art Nouveau and Art Deco. This combination of styles includes the sweeping lines of the 20s and the geometric ornamentation of the 30s. But the defining aspect is that timber was becoming scarce for mass production, and more ply and veneer was being included. Silky oak, coachwood and many other Australian hardwoods were being used, but in many cases they were stained to look like walnut, mahogany or even red cedar. The rainforest timber coachwood, although scarce, is still used for handles, carving, veneer and some furniture. For a while it was a common cabinet timber with a pale pink texture and a fairly straight grain, but usually requires staining to bring it to life. These are the main cabinet timbers used in the history of Australian cabinet making. There are others, of course, but these are the ones that you're most likely to encounter. Knowing this should help you identify and age a piece of furniture.